All right. So put your game show hats on. We're going to continue with that game of Name That Fallacy. And so, to start, we're raising money to help cure Alzheimer's. If you don't donate, you're part of the problem. What do we have here? Straw man? I don't really see the straw man in this one. I think I had another one in mind with this example. Maybe there's a word missing. Either you donate or you're part of the problem. I looked at this as an either-or fallacy because it only presents two options, right? And it assumes there's no possible scenario that's not one of those two. Maybe you can't afford to donate. That's another possibility, but this person's not considering that. You might say this looks like an ad hominem, and I wanted to make a comment last week. Sometimes we look at rudeness and we think that's an ad hominem attack, but it's not necessarily the same thing. Remember, an ad hominem attack is you are attacking the traits or the character of a person as if that invalidates what they're saying. You could commit any of these fallacies in a rude way, so don't conflate rudeness with ad hominem. All right, next example. I would never drive a Volkswagen because Hitler was behind the founding of that company. Which is true, by the way. That's real history.
Is it really?
That is. Genetic. Yep. Saying something is invalid because of how it began or who started it. Carl loves to read romance novels, and he wants to read more of them. When deciding on which new book to buy at the bookstore, he decides to take the book that has been the bestseller for that year. Bandwagon, or appeal to majority, right? Not to say he won't enjoy it. You know, people do this every day, but the only reasoning he's using is, well, lots of people have read this book, so I want to as well. The group Greenpeace doesn't have effective strategies to solve the climate issue because they're a bunch of lazy hippies. Ad hominem, that's all I could really think with this one. Perhaps another one maybe. There could be shades of hasty generalization in here. You don't know that about all members of Greenpeace, but I certainly had ad hominem in mind. And this is a case where it is also just plain rude. Next example. Marriage counseling causes divorce because so many people who see a marriage counselor also end up getting divorced, which, by the way, is true. I thought I heard it.
Circular reasoning.
It's not circular reasoning, actually. There's another one. Also not that one. It's the one we haven't actually had an example of yet, I think, or one of the ones we haven't had an example.
Post hoc, ergo, propter hoc.
Yes, the tongue twister one. I didn't tell you last week. You can shorten it to post hoc, and that's acceptable. But we're saying one thing came before the other, so therefore one thing must have caused the other thing. People went to a marriage counselor before they got divorced, so ergo they must have gotten divorced because they went to a marriage counselor, and that's not the case at all. So that's the case of post hoc. Okay. Did you hear about those teenagers that vandalized the store downtown? Teenagers are so irresponsible and thoughtless. Hasty generalization. I'll just say HG. Two mothers are talking about how to respond to their crying babies. The one mother advises the other that she shouldn't pick up the baby every time they cry because then they'll never learn to be independent. And they'll grow up to have severe attachment issues, which could make it nearly impossible for them to maintain healthy romantic relationships later in life. There's a slippery slope. A Democrat politician says that he wants to spend more money on social safety nets. His Republican opponents call him a communist. I would agree. Data shows that as ice cream consumption increases, so too does a rise in crime rates. One then assumes that eating ice cream contributes to rising crime. I actually was looking at this one again, and this one could be a mix of a few. It could even be an example that's not on the list. I thought I heard one. What was it? Hasty generalization. I think it's fair to say there's some aspect of hasty generalization here. You're looking at one piece of data and saying that that compares to another. The other one, too, is that this could be another kind of cousin of post hoc, ergo propter hoc. One thing happens, therefore it causes the other. There's actually a subset of that called cum hoc, ergo propter hoc. If you know your Latin, cum is with. So it's a fine distinction, but instead of it follows one thing, therefore it was caused by it, this fallacy is it happens at the same time as something, therefore. It's basically correlation equals causation fallacy, which is not the case. This is real data, by the way. Ice cream consumption does correspond to rising crime rates, but the reason is because there's more crime in the summer. People commit crimes when it's warm outside. They don't want to do it when it's cold. If you don't say the Pledge of Allegiance, then you must be a traitor. Either or, yep. And the last one, the worker at the coffee shop said Happy Holidays to me instead of Merry Christmas. Clearly their company hates Christmas and hates Christians.
Hasty generalization?
I think that's fair to say. Maybe it's a case of either or, but I think hasty generalization is probably the best answer there. You're not considering any other reasons why they might do that. You know, maybe there's people who aren't Christians or don't celebrate Christmas who they also want to sell coffee to, so they're trying to be as friendly to as many people as possible. You don't know. Okay, and that's the end of the game. So thank you all. That was fun. I'm going to turn that off for a while just so that it's not a distraction. So we get into the sheet for lesson 2. And this is where we're going to begin talking actually about some of the arguments that you might hear and make regarding apologetics. So if you feel like we spent way too long on theoretical examples, we're done with that. Let's get to some other ideas here. And I opened up the sheet with a discussion of what some people call the classical method of apologetics. There are a few methods that you can find that there's writing about. The classical method basically tries to do two things. First, it tries to establish the ability to believe in a God. It merely looks at the physical evidences and philosophical arguments for the existence of some God, any kind of God, right? And that's the first thing that you can try to get someone to believe, that maybe there is a God. And then the second step of classical apologetics is, okay, now that we can believe there may be some God, how do we arrive at the God of the Bible is the most reasonable God, the most like the God that we can believe in, based on what we see. I want us to think about the question a little bit. Why from looking at nature do people question the existence of God? Why do you think that is the case? Purely looking at nature, the cosmos, the natural universe, what do you think? I mean, we kind of tend to have a pretty strong bias where we throw up a picture of, and I'm not calling you out, Jeff, but we throw up a picture of galaxies and we look at that and we say, look at God. Look at the majesty of God, right? But really, are you seeing God when you look at one of those pictures? And you could answer this a couple of ways. There's no wrong answers.
I think one of the reasons is I don't know of anyone that can look at it without any perceived interpretation. You can't wipe out what you've learned. And so most people have been told there's either creation or evolution. And so you will tend to gravitate whichever one fills your need and what you want to find.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you look at it from well, this happened by accident design, you can find evidence to support that. If you go at it, well, I believe there's a creator, you can find evidence to support that. So I think we look at it based upon the answer we seek and the information that we've been fed over time.
Right. Yeah, it's the longer you look into this, the more you realize it is incredibly, incredibly hard to actually divorce your biases and what you already want to prove to be true from what you're seeing. That's incredibly hard to do. One of the people I've read, I actually read his book last week, or not last week, last year. Dr. Francis Collins was the head of the Human Genome Project, and he wrote about his conversion to becoming a Christian. He did not start as a Christian. He wasn't raised as a Christian. He went into medical sciences and biology and still wasn't a Christian. And so he said that everything that he studied and everything that he learned, he presupposed that there was not a God. So that formed the explanation of the way that he interpreted everything. And so it was only later when he became a Christian that he realized how many things he was looking at and refusing to look at something else because he knew, well, that can't be the case because I already know the conclusion, right? You're arguing by affirming the consequent, essentially. But I think people question the existence of God because God is unseen, is he not? I mean, no one has seen God. No one sees God in this world. Understand what I mean. You know, we talk about seeing God in the created works, but we don't see him himself. God is intangible, and he goes against the laws of nature. So one of the things we'll find is that it is going to be hard for us to try to prove to someone that God is real looking at nature alone, because God doesn't operate under nature. He's not confined by nature. I asked the question too, what do you think are some potential strengths and some potential weaknesses of looking at the natural world? And here I do want to hear your answers on this one. I want to hear your answers on every question. I didn't mean it like that.
I think the strength is something doesn't come from nothing. There's got to be a source of what we see.
Okay. Right. So it has to do with questions that both sides need to answer, right? It is somewhat universal in its application. Grace?
There are a lot of very delicate balances in nature that would lend themselves toward the idea of less something that took place by chance in millions or billions of years and lends itself more to the idea of a designer. But at the same time, there are a lot of processes that seem fairly chaotic, which could lend itself more toward the idea of naturalism than it would the God that we at least hold up as being the God of creation, because of the fact that he is perfect and good, and there are a lot of processes that seem chaotic and not really good at their root. So that aspect of it could be a negative from the perspective of people who see a conflict there between what we preach with regard to God and his nature and what they witness in the world around them. The existence of moral good or moral evil certainly poses a problem for a lot of people, perhaps who are already predisposed or biased against God, but they see that as an argument for the fact that there is no such thing as God, that he doesn't exist, or if he does, he's not what we believe him to be.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for that. Go ahead, Dad.
There'd be an analogy you might not be comfortable with, but if you would think about an amoeba, so you trapped in a drop of pond water, and you put them under a slide, and put that slide in your microscope and hit it with the bright lights, does that amoeba start looking around and saying, I wonder how they made this microscope? I wonder who it is that's staring at me through this large aperture where I see a giant eyeball. Do we even surmise or imagine that the amoeba has the ability to understand its circumstances, its surroundings, technology, human beings? And so why do we presume that we have the ability to understand our surroundings? I think we give ourselves too much credit. I would surmise, I would suppose, there are many things God could explain in great detail about creation that we couldn't grasp any more than the amoeba, the microscope. some ways it's not as important for us to understand our surroundings as we may give credit as well. And that may be another problem with our search for answers, is we're trying to answer questions when the questions that need answering the most are the glaring things in front of us that we tend to ignore as we search for answers for questions we don't have answers for.
Okay. So would you say, if I'm summarizing this right, that a negative side of trying to look purely at nature to prove the existence of God is we can't comprehend a higher intelligence by what we can understand with nature? The analogy you gave, I've heard similar analogies made for, well, are there aliens out there? And one of the arguments that has been postured is that if there's aliens out there and they've contacted us, they could be on a higher plane of intelligence so that we can't even tell that they're there. So as the amoeba can't comprehend ant society can't comprehend a pack of lions, and the pack of lions doesn't give any thought to humans. So there's kind of an issue there of can we even comprehend something that we're claiming is a higher plane of intelligence? If we're saying it's God, how can we perceive anything about the presence or nature of God unless He makes it known to us? Maybe I worded the question a little bit confusingly. I think less so what are the strong or weak arguments. What I was kind of getting at is what just is the advantage of doing it this way versus another way, or what would be the disadvantage? One of the advantages that I thought for this method is that this does not depend on using inspired text first. This is a way of breaking into a conversation with someone who maybe doesn't think that the Bible is anything more than a collection of fairy tales. It doesn't depend on Revelation not the book of Revelation, but Revelation itself. It doesn't depend on Revelation to form its basis. I think we've talked about some of the drawbacks, that we are limited in what we can prove from the natural world, especially when we're trying to prove something is not natural, is supernatural. That's really trying to work backwards, where I don't think we have the information to do so all the time. Go ahead, Brace.
I think another weakness is that most of us are not experts on the cosmological world. I mean, there are people who have addressed this topic who are microbiologists or astronomers, or people who've studied various sciences and can speak to those at a professional level that we can't.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do think that's a drawback. We may be hobbyists in the sense that that's kind of what I consider myself.
I like that term.
I like to look at all of those different aspects of things, but I'm by no means an expert. I'm not an archaeologist, I'm not a geologist, I'm not an astronomer, I'm not any of those things, and don't claim to be. And so we can stride into areas that we really don't fully understand, just as much as we do in other areas of life. And that can put us in some precarious situations. We make claims that we can't substantiate because we're not experts.
Right.
And the people we're talking to may know more about it than we do. And so that can be a difficult place to be, and sometimes a little dangerous maybe.
That is territory that is ripe for straw man fallacies. If you are ignorant of something and you oversimplify the argument and then attack that simplified argument, you are committing a fallacy by oversimplifying and not addressing the actual point. And so I think that is a legitimate weakness, is that we're not experts in the fields that many of these topics revolve around. I think most of the people we talk to aren't necessarily experts either. I've never talked one-on-one with an astrophysicist or a evolutionary biologist. I've read their works, but those people aren't exactly a dime a dozen. Dan and then Chuck.
I've said before that I want that faith to be an evolutionist as well. What we don't realize is there's no cut and dry science that proves their point either. There's no cut and dry science that proves creation. So it takes a modicum of faith in both answers. So, and we think that we don't understand that they're relying on faith to believe in their position as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's, we think that we're the only ones with faith. No, we have faith in God, and we say, be faith, yes, but it also understanding and reliance upon unfounded science or unfounded projections or hypotheses for evolution to work.
Okay. I would agree that both positions get to a point where you do have to have a measure of faith. Both reach an end point where there's a limit to where we can observe and see any kind of hard proofs. Chuck and then Dad.
But I think also, us not being the expert, we may figure that the data has been manipulated because the expert is trying to persuade you his way rather than, so it's kind of like, who do you, again, I guess it would be faith, who do you believe? Is he trying to manipulate the data just to prove his point that it is evolution?
Right. And that's where, depending on where you're getting your source matters a lot. I place a lot of credibility and I give a lot of benefit of doubt to the scientific community because the process of getting something published, getting something established or checked and verified by other experiments is very rigorous. We don't always know how much difficulty goes into that. And in a lot of the people I've read, you don't pick up, and maybe it's so craftily well hidden, I don't know if I'm just glossing over it, but I rarely pick up undertones of malicious intent or bending the information. I would posture there are very few evolutionists or scientists out there who are out to topple religion. That's not their goal. Their goal is to try to make sense of what they're seeing with the information that they have and the presuppositions and biases that they have, sure. But I don't think there's malicious intent per se. Now you read someone like Richard Dawkins and his early works kind of were there and his later works very much, he got very bitter and sour about religion. So he's very much about, I want to topple religion because I don't like it. And he's very explicit about that. Dad, and then I think Bryce.
Well, I was going to make the same point as Chuck, but I heard a podcast not a couple of weeks ago talking about how much peer-reviewed material gets published, but you can't repeat the experiment. And they went into great detail talking about how that the data set doesn't match up with the conclusions, and the material gets published anyway. And there were 4 or 5 scientists who got together and sort of observed this in their own community, and they went out to create a preposterous theory, and then they used real data from real people to prove it. But the conclusion was idiotic, and they did it on purpose. And then they were really excited that they got it published in a peer-reviewed article. And a lot of people, they said, got really mad because the scientific community said, "Don't make us look bad. It's easy enough the way we do this already." But they went on to argue that even though the data set may not be, maybe the experiment's not verifiable, that doesn't mean that they intentionally drew a bad conclusion. So there's just weaknesses in the scientific method itself. And this is beyond what Chuck said about, there is just outright fraud. And there have been many theories in history that they're still questioning some people who said, based on their conclusions, you really didn't get this right, did you? And then 20, 30 years after they publish their results, they recant and say, no, I fixed the numbers to make it say what I wanted to say. It's not an uncommon occurrence, unfortunately.
Sure. Yeah. And so thanks for undermining what I just said. But I think I think it's fair to mention that, and I do appreciate that because I may have glossed over a little too much what the point you were making, Chuck. So thank you for that.
But the point is they weren't falsifying data to prove God doesn't exist. They were falsifying data because they had a grant that said, go prove something.
And that happens too, actually. I have learned in the history of a lot of the science that is critical of climate change is financed by the oil industry. It's very interesting to look at that. But oil companies pay for studies that say climate change is not true. Why? Because they sell oil, okay? They want people to not think climate change is true. So there is a lot of money, there's a lot of trying to get grants and trying to stay in the good graces of organizations that can give them money, so that is true. There can be a lot of that going on as well. Bryce?
But the counter argument to that is that Silicon Valley pays a lot of money to keep the climate change model going. Because it's in their financial best interest.
Sure.
So, I mean, there are lobbyists on both sides of the fence.
Well, who makes the money if everybody has to buy an electric car? It's whoever's selling the electric cars. So everybody's got motives. That's
But the
true.
other thing I was gonna mention with regard to what you said, because I don't necessarily think that you're wrong. I think there are a lot of people out there who are naturalists, who are honest people, who are simply interpreting the data based on not only what they see, but their own personal bias that the world it's happened by natural processes. And to the point that you made, that there may be few, and certainly they exist, people who manipulate the data and do things in a dishonest way in the evolutionary world. There are also those same groups of people in the creation model
Yes,
who manipulate the data
I believe so.
and extract portions of it in order to bolster their position as well. And so dishonesty happens on both sides of that fence. And the reality is that, I mean, what we're looking for is data that is unbiased. Now, that's a little bit of a misnomer because, as you pointed out, we're all biased. But people who are trying to look at the data and weigh it honestly, and not throw out the pieces that don't bolster their position. And so it can be difficult. It can be hard. And I try to look at both sides of the equation as much as I can, just to kind of get where both people are coming from, and then draw my conclusions.
Yeah. Brace used the term naturalist or naturalism. Naturalism is a worldview where nature is the definitive and only reality, and it denies the existence of things like the supernatural. All things have their origin in some natural explanation. And if that's a person's worldview, when they're looking at the origins of life or the origins of the universe, they're just trying to find something that makes the most sense based on the fact that they think, well, it has to come from nature. That's all I know. So I need to, there's got to be something that makes the most sense from that standpoint. Taylor, you had your hand up?
Can I spend science and nature a different way a little bit?
Sure.
So translation. So this can be a strength and weakness.
Mhm.
Strength of, we have faith in God that it's been translated through decades, century, millennia. But weakness, and I've heard this from people, weakness of how do you know? How do you know the translators? How do you know? And I don't know the answer to that. How do we know?
Yeah, I want to get to that in this class. I do want to talk about looking at the Bible as a work of history and a work of inspiration and trying to reconcile those. For those who didn't see, when Taylor said this, she held up her Bible. And it is true that we come at the Bible with the exact same biases that a scientist might come at evolutionary theory. Something I learned interesting the other day that just seems blasphemous when you say it. Jesus was not his name. You know that? His name was not Jesus. His name was Yeshua, and Jesus was a transliteration of that term. His name was Joshua. But we call him Jesus because it got transliterated that way, and that's what it says in our Bibles. Now, am I going to stop saying Jesus? No. But his name wasn't Jesus. It's just the history of the word shows us that.
Christ wasn't his last name.
And Christ was not his last name. No, he was not JC, Jesus Christ. You're right. So we come at the Bible with biases all the time as well. And when we're faced with something that tells us that that's wrong, what are we going to do? Are we going to scramble for, no, I have to be right, or are we going to keep an open mind? So thank you, Taylor. Okay, one more, and then I want to get to some Bible passages.
Well, this is if I remember right, this came from Don Patton, so this is many years ago here, and maybe the first time he was here, but there are certain publications that the scientific community approves, and if you don't publish in those approved scientific publications, then
You get called a
You're-
pseudoscientist.
your study is not legitimate. But you have to fall under those who allow these research into these documents, into these publications. So you have to follow their guidelines, and their guidelines may be prejudiced and and usually are prejudiced to the point that you can't publish something that's contradictory to what they believe in their publications, so therefore you can never get, it's a circular reasoning, or is you can't ever get into their publication to disprove them, because they won't allow you into their publication. So it's kind of, you can't have a legitimate source or be legitimately published, because if you disagree, if your study disagrees with their worldview.
Yeah.
So the editors of the publications control whether or not you can do that, and yet you can't be, well, I said legitimate if you don't publish in their document.
I think that's fair to say. Editorial boards may be separate from the person doing the research, and they have biases and they have motives too. So you're right in pointing that out. I wanted us to look for a minute at what were some passages that you came up with to talk about God being known through the observable or material things. I've gotten a couple comments that this Bible class is a little light on Bible sometimes, so I wanted to rectify that by we'll probably spend the rest of class on this, because I did a kind of a search for some terms last night, and I found a couple passages that honestly I had never seen as being talking about this before, but I found them just really interesting. But I want to know what were some passages that you all had, and we can read those.
Can you repeat your question? Sorry.
Sorry, that was very long-winded, wasn't it?
Okay.
What are some passages that talk about God being known from the observable and material things of the universe?
For some reason I'm thinking like Romans. Is it Romans? It talks about like failing that excuse.
Yes. So Romans chapter 1. We'll start there. I want to read through these just so that we can appreciate them a bit. Romans 1, and then can I get someone to read 18 through 25? Angie, you want to read for us?
For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world, in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things.
Okay, thank you. Oh, I'm sorry, I told you to read through 23 maybe. 24 and 25 also says, therefore God gave them up to the lusts of their heart, to impurity, dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. I wanted to include that verse too, because this verse combines the truth about God and his creator nature in the same sentence. To me, I thought that was significant in showing his status as a creator is also his status as being one who is true and one who gives truth. And then the verses that we most likely think of in this, it acknowledges God's invisible attributes. So the Bible's not afraid to say, yes, God is invisible. God is not seen in nature as far as a being, but he can be perceived from the things that are made. So I like that example there. That is a good one. Any other passages people had for this idea?
Psalm 19.
Psalm 19, yep.
And I would include verses 1 through 4.
Okay. I said 1 through 6, but
You could.
you want to go ahead and read that for us, Bryce.
The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words whose voice is not heard. Their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. In them he has set a tent for the sun, which comes out like a bridegroom leaving his chamber, and like a strong man runs its course with joy. Its rising is from the end of the heavens, and its circuit to the end of them, and there is nothing hidden from its heat.
Okay, thank you. So what's significant here, in this passage, what jumps out to you the most?
Honestly, the part that jumps out to me the most is verses 3 and 4, where essentially it says that everything in all of creation speaks the glory of God because of his creative power. And it's a little hard to know, is he talking about the inanimate creation? Is he talking about the animate creation that is not man? Or is he talking about everything? Because he does use the term voice,
Right.
though it could be more of a metaphor with regard to just the fact that everything in creation screams aloud that God exists. Or it could be that we, mankind throughout all of creation, because of what we see, proclaim the glory of God. Now we may do that in a variety of ways. The Greeks and Romans and the Egyptians used various aspects of the natural world to become gods, or to be the gods who were in power over those things. But it's still looking to a higher being and a creative power that is behind all of those things. And so if we're just trying to establish the existence of a supernatural being, all of those groups have done that, whether it's Christianity or the Egyptians or the Romans or the Greeks have done that through looking at the natural world. So,
Yeah, I think I've always read this as it is the inanimate creation that speaks. It is, this is poetic language. We don't hear the voice of stars talking, but now you can point, radio microscopes at stars and they make sound. That's kind of cool if you've ever listened to what a star sounds like. But I've always read it as the inanimate creation has a voice because of its attributes, because of its design or nature. In verse 4, their voice goes out through all the earth. My Bible has a note that can also be translated, their measuring line goes out through all the earth. That and verse 6, where it talks about the circuit of the sun, the path that it follows, the trace and the lines that make up the way that all these things move, to me points as well to the precise measurements of everything, the precise order of everything, and the working together of all these systems in a way where, we'll study in just a little bit, if things are a little bit off this way or a little bit off this way, it can't work, it can't function. Did anyone have any other passages?
Acts 14, 15 through 17.
Acts 14, 15 through 17?
Men, why are you doing these things? We are also men of the same nature as you, and preach the gospel to you in order that you should turn from the vain things to the living God, who made the heaven and the earth, the sea, and all the things in them. The generations gone by, he permitted all nations to go on their own way, and yet he did not leave himself without witness, in that he did good and gave you rain from the heavens and fruitful seasons, satisfying your heart with food and gladness.
Thank you, Chuck. I didn't have that one on my list. I hadn't come across that one, so I like that. I like that mention of him giving witness, that God, he leaves behind a witness for himself. This passage, you could almost say, and I just had this thought while you were reading this. Some people criticize, well, if God is real, why does he seem to just ignore, is he not active in his creation? Did he just set things in motion and leave them be? I feel like this passage kind of points to that God allows the order that he established from the beginning to run its course. He allows things to operate as he designed them to work. He made nature robust to accommodate change and accommodate fluctuations in the seasons and the times. I've already lost the verse where it said that. I'm in Acts 14, right?
verse 17, did not leave himself without witness.
Right. I meant in verse 16 where he says he allowed the nations to walk in their own ways. You could point to that. Some people will criticize God. Well, God just left it alone. He made it and then he left it alone. And that's not, I think, evidence for non-existence of God. I think that's evidence that he set things up to work in a way where he wouldn't have to constantly intervene. God doesn't have to jump in every 100 years and poke the earth so that it gets back on track. He designed it so that it stays on track. So I like that one there. Anyone else? I mean, there's a lot. Anywhere where you essentially see a lot of the poetic language where God describes himself, or where God is described as he laid the foundations of the earth, he was there before the foundations of the earth. In the Psalms, Job has a lot of this language. Let's look, I'll read from Job 12 real quick here. And I could read all of Job 38, because that's God speaking about himself and his works. But in Job 12, Job is speaking, and he says in verse 7, 8, and 9, "Ask the beasts, and they will teach you, the birds of the heavens, and they will tell you, or the bushes of the earth, and they will teach you, and the fish of the sea will declare to you. Who among all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? In his hand is the life of every living thing and the breath of all mankind." Job 38 is God speaking to Job and saying, are you going to question me? Do you know how I did all these things? Do you know how verse 4, "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements, or who stretched the line upon it?" Again, reference to measurement and fine-tuning, I think, can be found in the scriptures, where God is saying, I made it just right. I made it just so that it works. If you relied on anything else, it wouldn't work. Romans 4:17 has I think a reference to this. The context is not talking about God necessarily creating the world, but it makes a statement about God that I think is very key to one of the arguments that we have here. Romans 4:17. Romans 4:17 says, "As it is written," he's talking about God, what God said to Abraham, "As it is written, I have made you the father of many nations, in the presence of the God in whom he believed, who gives life to the dead and calls into existence the things that do not exist." So I gravitated to that passage when it comes to what I call the cosmological argument. It's basically, why is there stuff? Things exist. Why? Well, this passage says that God is one who calls into existence things that do not exist. And nature is not in the habit of bringing things into existence that do not exist. Life begets life, matter forms into new matter, but it's all from pre-existing material. Not so with God.
Hebrews 11 makes the same point.
Hebrews 11?
Point.
How does it word it there?
Hebrews 11, verse 3, "By faith we understand that the universe was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible."
Mm-hmm.
So, in other words, the creation, as the creationists say, ex nihilo, from nothing,
Yeah. All right.
out of nothing, I guess literally.
From out of nothing. Thank you for your participation this morning. I'm sorry I went over time a little bit. I will open next Wednesday in Proverbs chapter 8, because there's a very interesting passage there that I do want to read. And then we will get started looking at the rest of the sheet for lesson 2.